directing it in the direction of light. And this is such an intense time, and human rights are at the center of what we are seeing, especially in the last 2 weeks in our country, demonstrations. And there are lots of back and forth from the government, the opposition, and now some just criminal elements. I mean, this thing is just getting, in a way, it's up in the air, And we are so glad to be joined today by one person who is always looking out, for whatever is happening in the community to make sure that the human rights are well respected. And that's none other than Irungu Houghton, who is the Executive Director of Amnesty International. And we are happy to have him and lots of insight. Please do join this conversation on 0708 222 323. That's our WhatsApp line. And also engage us on our social media platforms. I'll be glad to have you as part of this conversation. Again, Irungu, welcome.
Thank you very much, Edward. It's a pleasure to be back. I always have it that Hope TV is a place where hope raisers exist. It's a privilege to be back. Thank you.
We're happy to have you back. And it's hard to smile now.
Smile we must.
It's difficult. We have to, just pull it out from a deep place, because what's going on in our country right now, we seem to just have come from an election, and that election was decided at the highest levels in terms of legality, and there seems to have been a settling down of the new government now having to just set itself up and then begin to work. But no sooner had this begun than now we're having lots of continuous chaos. We have Mondays, we have Thursdays, apparently endlessly, until some meaningful thing happens. Now, Irungu, I just want to invite you to maybe put this for us on a global map, because we may think that it is isolated to us, but maybe not. But you can maybe just help us see how this could be also a global, have a global connection.
So this conversation is actually happening at a great opportune moment, because yesterday Amnesty International released its State of Human Rights report, and we looked at over 180 countries, and the global trends tell us that this is a period of intense financial uncertainty. It's a period of global recession. It's a period where there are levels of displacement that we've not seen in recent times. Not just the Ukraine or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it's also to do with places like Ethiopia and DRC. And, with those conflicts have come, mass crimes. Crimes against humanity, mass rapes, and in many cases, one of the concerns is that we are going to see great displacement of human beings across not just Africa, but even Europe and the Middle East. So it really is a difficult time all around. I think on the political side, we've seen the rise of populist leaders who have a great disdain for international conventions and standards, despite the fact that this is the 75th anniversary. This year is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What we're seeing from the global policy architecture, the United Nations and the various international bodies, is that there is a lot of double standards. What this is allowing is essentially for demagogic and divisive leaders to emerge and really just play with divisions among their nations. And in that sense, Kenya, is not unique in that regard, because we are also going through a very intense recession. The inequalities, the economic inequalities are very harsh. We have about 6 million people who go hungry every night. We have 2 million children out of school. We have 60,000 job seekers coming onto the market every year, and we just don't have the jobs for them or the economic opportunities for them. So we are, like the rest of the world, grappling with this at this time. But I think the important thing is not to allow that to give us a sense of complacency, but really to give us a sense of urgency to respond to the things that really matter to millions of our population.
Okay. And some references have been made and comparisons made with South Africa, And, some of these places, the cost of living has been a big mention. And when you listen to many analysts looking for some valid reasons for their present demonstrations, and I mean, one area that is not in contest is the cost of living.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got two things happening at the same time in several countries. March the 20th, ironically, was World Happiness Day. Globally, right? But we had four nations going through very large protests. You had Tunisia, you had South Africa, you had, of course, the first of the, as I call them, the first episode of the series called Mandamano, and you had Nigeria, which was a post-election, protest. And, all of those places really have a number of things in common. You have, of course, the recession, the financial crisis. These are places also where there are large levels of inequalities. Hope, not the radio station, but the emotion is not present in many of these countries. And you have now the politics of grievance. And, politics of grievance, I think, has to be studied very carefully because if you remember during the elections, it was the grievances, the worries around, exclusive governance, bloated governance, state captures it was called, and the lack of economic opportunities that really galvanized the hustler nation, as it was called, and propelled President Ruto and Deputy President Rigathi into power. But the problem is that, it's easy to make campaign promises. It is so much difficult, more difficult to essentially govern a runaway, economy. Or to deal with issues of, food or fuel crises. And South Africa has, on top of what we have, has had this crippling energy crisis. And I think that's been the challenge for South Africa more. But I think the political class particularly the opposition, have learnt that the way that you destabilize the government in power essentially is to work the grievances, And that's, I think, what's happening here also.
Okay. Going back to the campaign promises, there was let me call it the philosophy of bottom up, which became very popular, and which I would say had a lot to do with the present government, our present administration coming to power, becoming popular the way it did, and just asking myself, even also on behalf of the viewers, how does the bottom up look like in a situation of dissatisfaction? As a philosophy that was supposed to go, or is supposed to go through and through. It's supposed to help make decisions. It's supposed to help give directions, because it's a philosophy, right? So how does it look like in a situation of this kind of unease?
No, I mean, I sense, I don't know if your viewers also sense this, but there is a sense of disillusionment. There is a sense that the promises that were very carefully crafted, in many ways they were resonated with millions of people, that they have just not come to pass. And with few exceptions, we've seen some real progress in terms of the mass housing programs and the different launches that have taken place. We've seen, of course, the Hustler Fund was a buzz for a lot of people who are struggling with, capital. And but I think on the big issues, people are not seeing a change. They're not seeing the introduction of social protection mechanisms. They're not seeing an expansion of the National Health Insurance Fund. They're not seeing greater, more opportunities for livelihoods in this period. And some of it, to be fair, is to do with international factors that although the Kenya Kwanza government, when it was in the opposition, basically said had nothing to do with the Ukraine crisis, much of this is part of the global crisis, and that's the challenge of fuel and food. But there are other dynamics. I think one of the things that in a period like this that an incumbent government has to be careful about is essentially looking like it is bloating the government. I mean, it's not a time for an obese state. It's not a time for a fat state. It's time really for a lean government. And I think if there is something that has triggered the more recent set of discontent, it has been really the appointment of these 50 cabinet chief administrative secretaries. There's also been concern that a number of the people who have been put into positions either in the parastatals or in the executive, that many of them have tainted careers. They are people who have fallen short of the Chapter 6, and in some cases were literally 2 steps away from becoming convicts for economic crimes. And I think that's the other thing that any incumbent government in any country needs to step away from, because it's one thing not to deliver on the promises, it's another to look like you are blatantly being wasteful and self-interested.
Yeah, I mean, and some time back, for months now, the big cry has been rain. Yeah. Once rain comes, we'll be sorted. Yeah. And the rain has finally come. But from what we see, Houghton, is that rain is not the problem. No. We seem to have other problems. Everyone was like, rain come, we prayed for rain, and now it's here now. Yeah, but we have a bigger crisis now than was, or an equally big crisis now with the rain. Yeah. Now that there is no peace, as we can observe.
So there's two analogies I think from this week that struck me. One was that yes, the rains did come, and thank God that they did. But at the same time, as we've been experiencing the rains, we now have water cannons dousing. Kawangware, Mathare, Kisumu, Kondele, and various other places. And as a friend of mine said, we've longed for water for irrigation for so long, but yet now we have water to be able to spray at 14,000 liters a water cannon. So that's one scenario, is that you can have rain and water, but actually if you're spending all of that essentially, washing down protesters, then it seems wasteful. The second thing I think is, one of the difficulties that the Jubilee administration had was they definitely overborrowed and exposed the country to these huge, in some cases odious loans or debts, and we now, as a consequence, have these wonderful highways, and this allows you to travel at 100, let's put, because we've got viewers watching, let's say 110 kilometers an hour, not more than that, people. But the reality is, if one of the trucks, as it did on Saturday, collapses and tips over, and out comes from the back of this truck beans and unga, the entire superhighway has to come to a standstill because people have jumped out of their vehicles with any vessel that they can find to scoop unga and beans and so on and take them home to their families. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, what's the point of a superhighway if you don't have a population that is able to feed itself? The speed, the possibility on that road deteriorates immediately in that situation. So I think we have to come back to the basics. And the basics are essentially a population that is prosperous, is safe from medical catastrophes and the costs of medical bills, and a population that is dignified. There's no dignity in jumping out of your vehicle to go and remove ugali and beans from the concrete and the tarmac. There's no dignity in that at all, and heaven forbid that it was not an oil tanker. Because we would have seen a different scenario, which could have been very dangerous. But I think the other thing, of course, is a population that is comfortable with diversity and is comfortable with and tolerant of the others, the people who are not like us. And I think that's the other challenge at a moment like this, because we know that with financial recessions, these are always periods for xenophobia. They're always periods at which racism and sexism and ableism, that is discrimination against people with disabilities or sexual minorities. This is the period where, it seems that we just like to pick on a minority and take them as a scapegoat.
I've got quite some perspectives there. And again, staying with, just trying to look at this, what's going on from different angles. And earlier on, you mentioned Chapter 6 of our Constitution. Let me loop the African tradition, African traditional community into this. Because if the African traditional community prides in the values, especially the Ubuntu, the community, the Utu, then we would not need a chapter 6 because it would come organically for us. But now it seems, Irungu, that values have become our biggest drought. Whereas, I mean, when you think African, you think, some really strong values, especially in terms of family, community.
No, I mean, we have a rich African history of, particularly in this part of Africa, where we didn't have very hierarchical societies. We had very open societies in many ways, gerontocracies, age-based governance systems. We may have, there were even the cases of the Wagowa Makere, which left us clear that there were periods where women actually were able to take leadership and provide leadership. There was respect for life. There was respect for, to some extent, diversity. Of course, we had the wars between different communities, but it was a different season altogether. I think what we are now experiencing really is a breakdown of this idea of Utuism, this idea that I am because you are. There are certain languages that, when they greet each other, and they, I think in Zimbabwe, the best example I was given is when somebody says, "How are you?" The response in the local language is, "I am well if you are also well." So we connect ourselves immediately with the people we're talking to, and I think that's beginning to break down.
How sad.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is a modern dynamic, which is that I don't think we have a shortage of laws. I don't think we have a shortage of standards. What we have, if I can use a legal phrase, is we have a great constitution, but very little constitutionalism. There is not a culture that is constitutional. Too many of us are comfortable with situation ethics. The husband who beats his wife yet goes into the office and is a perfect gentleman to his women colleagues. The person who literally would steal everything in sight if they could be assured that they would not be caught. So we're now getting to a situation where it's looking bleak, I think, for a lot of people now. But I think the main thing for me is always to recognize that darkness, darkness never ever prevails. I mean, even in terms of the calendar and the horoscopes, there will always be dawn. There will always be cracks because that's how light gets in. And our job, I think, as hope raisers, is always to look for the light, look for the spaces, and widen those spaces to allow for those people who really do have life experiences to share, to be able to do that, and inspire other people.
I like that, hope raisers.
Hope raisers.
And that darkness never prevails.
It never does.
There will always be cracks someplace. And that's really a very hopeful message coming from Hope TV. That's what we
consistent with the brand.
I mean, that said, Kenya is will be 60 like this year. I mean, it's 60, right? Yeah. And every time there's a language of our democracy has come very far. Right. At some places where there could be, as you said, some light, some people have said our democracy has come of age. Right. But from what's been happening in the last few weeks, how would you assess our state of democracy? Would you say that we are stagnant? Would you say that we are losing what we've gained? Would you say that we are still far away from seeing the light?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think there are a couple of things. First of all, just as a light touch, I think as we turn 60, there are some in the Republic who are probably suggesting we should retire Kenya, and look for a younger model, and I don't know whether that's East Africa or whether it's Africa, but, the frame of reference, I think, has always been very important to us as Africans, But I think, we are at a point really, where we have to question the foundations of our democracy and protect them. So I was very active during the post-election violence in 2008, and even before that in 1994 during the ethnic clashes. And those two experiences really left me present to how important it is for people to keep searching out for people who are like-minded, who have similar values, and continue to speak, boldly about virtues and a virtuous society. And that we spend too much time probably and too much airtime with those people who have only vices to bring to us. And I think for me at this time, really what we need to be doing is we need to be reaffirming aspects of the Constitution. One aspect of the Constitution that is really critical this time is Article 37, which is the article that gives all the constitutional right to protest, to assemble, and taken with other parts of the Constitution, the freedom of expression, the freedom of association. It's not at a time like this you want to suspend those. And this is why I think, the crisis we currently have with mandamanos is primarily to do with the misgoverning of essentially a intense period. You cannot ban a constitutional right. It's not an optional protocol. It's not an operational guideline of the National Police Service. It is a constitutional, article, and therefore the question really is how soon can we see three levels of dialogue? I mean, the first level is, between the Inspector General and the Assembly organizers. I think it is still possible to essentially reach an agreement on locations, routes, marshalling, and how the demonstrations would be organized. Some of them have been peaceful, at least for a while. And then the police show up and there's tear gas and then there's water and then people get arrested. And then, of course, we see the chaos that we saw on Monday. So I think that is possible still. I think the second thing is that the Inspector General has a number of levers that are available to him. He has the independent offices, the constitutional commissions, the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, the Kenya National Commission for Human Rights. He has a number of human rights organizations that do monitoring. Task them with independent monitoring of these events. Task them with independent, neutral monitoring of the assemblies, and essentially have them pronounce whether the demonstrations were initially peaceful, distinguish between who are looters, who are protesters, who are police officers, and even police officers in this context are not always easy to spot, because unfortunately, too many of them, even if when they're carrying AK-47s and G3 rifles, they're in plain clothes with no badges. And then the fourth group, of course, is, I think, the majority, which is, the average Kenyan citizen who's taking their children to school, who's trying to open the kiosk for the day, who's trying to get to work. But at the moment, what you have is just a chaos because there is no structured environment for that. And then I think, of course, the third level of dialogue has to be with the politicians. The issues that have been raised by Azimio are not simple and they are not the same. So they need to be unbundled and a set of conversations take place that essentially restores trust and credibility. And if there is no capacity for that, if the hardliners are too hardline and too warrior-like at this point, then we have to look for mediators. And the history of this country is that when Kenyan mediators are put aside or pushed aside, then unfortunately we have to bring in external mediators. And I think already we're starting to see shuttle diplomacy. Senator Chris Combs is in town from the state of Delaware, and he's essentially coming in to see whether they can help. We've got already the African Union declaring that we are a worrying case, let me put it that way. I mean, I think the AU tends to focus on places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Uganda. Now, unfortunately, Kenya has the honor or the dishonor of being an African concern.
You know, I just talk about that. I've just remembered that Kenya, is in the lead in terms of restoring peace, in the region.
Yeah.
And now we ourselves are patients of the same. And when you think about what's going on right now, and one of the things that you've mentioned is about dialogue. Yeah. And you've talked about it as a matter of fact. You even have put several levels of dialogue that need to happen. But there are those who think that dialogue, is out of the question. And the church is really trying to it's becoming stronger and stronger in terms of just stating the need for dialogue between the administration and the opposition. But they are really hard stances.
Yeah.
I mean, how do we thaw this? How do we thaw this big gap?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I think always, it's there's a saying that actually, if you want to judge a person, judge them not by their intentions. Don't even judge them by their actions, but judge them by the impact that they leave, and the impact of their intentions and their actions. And I think that, for me, always is the starting point. What is the impact of this impasse? The impact is essentially this, is on average, every time we have Nairobi shut down, even partially, let's say 30% of Nairobi, we lose between 2 billion and 3 billion shillings in terms of GDP. We've already been told by the stock exchange that there is capital flight as a result of the last 1 week. And that could be in the range of about 8 billion. We have seen the Maseno University student, William Mayanga, lose his life. I think he has now been followed by at least 5 other cases. So there are 5, maybe 15 families that are either mourning loved ones or essentially accompanying them to hospitals. Not all of these are civilians. We have 30 officers, we're told by the Inspector General, who are hurt in the course of duty. We have communities that have not been able to open up their businesses, be able to bring food home at night. Essentially, 2 days out of every 7 is an extremely punishing cycle for a lot of people with very few savings. I was in Kibra yesterday, and we've talked a lot about the horror of a church and a mosque being burnt, literally facing each other with a small brook, a little stream between them. And I jumped across that stream as I went back and forth between the mosque and the PCA church. And we have not talked enough about the businesses that were burnt. And these are essentially kiosks that run through the main street of Kibra and the Karanja side, and homes that were destroyed. And I think one of the things that we were discussing with the Kibra leadership and KEPSA is whether we can have a drive to restore some of those properties to people. And one of the challenges I left the religious communities there was whether the Muslims would help rebuild the PCA church and whether the Christians would jump across the stream and go rebuild the mosque. And I think for me that would be another, to use a biblical word, that would be a miracle. That would be a miracle worked by God's people.
Well, I think that, I remember you making that call, and I thought about it. What would that take? On one hand, and on the other hand would be what would prevent it? Because I think that would serve not only as buildings restored, but it would actually serve as a statement. It would be a story, like a powerful story.
I would be inspired.
It was a powerful story, and we hope that as the strategies are made around the construction of those sanctuaries, that voice will remain, that voice will arise, because it will be such a museum of peace, and we hope that keeps running. And again, when you look at the present leadership right now, there has been a certain feel that this chaos and this time is up in the air. We don't know where the center is. We can't put where the leadership is. There are all manner of statements from every place, and some places we expect voices, they are silent. So we don't know. It's like something's up in the air. What did you comment about the leadership in the last 2 weeks, and maybe some tweaks we must make in days to come?
Yeah, without sounding anti-male, which would be a bit of an oxymoron for me, but I think there's too much toxic masculinity. There's just too much bravado, too much brinkmanship, too much in the way of abuse that's being hurled at each other. When you have very senior statesmen saying, come for me, I will meet you man to man. And then you have a state officer responsible for security essentially saying, I will, come for me, don't come for my juniors. You realize that actually something has got lost in this process, you know, and essentially what has got lost is the respect for the rule of law, respect for grace, and a level of compassion and an empathy. And what you have essentially is the same kind of behavior that you see on social media, in those Twitter spaces where people are throwing barbs at each other the whole time through the comfort of their digital devices. But the difference is these are people who command the respect of hundreds of thousands of people. And what we have to recognize that even if the Supreme Court has pronounced the Kenya Kwanza government and the president and William Ruto, the president and the presidency of this country, the split between Kenya Kwanza and Azimio was very narrow. I mean, there's 230,000 votes. So there is a different style of governing that's required. That is, I guess, that is not totalitarian. It's not authoritarian. It's not absolutist. It's really about dialogue and agreement, consensus building. But at the moment, that's not happening. And I really do believe that it will happen. The question is at what cost? How far down this road do we have to roll? How many car crashes do we need to see before people say, okay, enough is enough?
And Houghton, a very important question there. What will it cost?
Yeah.
That finally there has to be a resolution, and dialogue will have to be part of the, in the picture. But after what cost? After what price? What prices will we have paid by the time we get to that point? And need we pay that price?
It's completely
Taking a short break. Viewer, we are talking about the state of the nation, and we are talking to Irungu Houghton, who is the Executive Director, Amnesty International, and very important questions and also very important insights, especially on the fact that there needs to be a different kind of governance. We're taking a short break. We'll be right back. This is Spotlight.
Je, ushawahi kuweka jambo kwenye mizani? Ushawahi kupata uzito wake? Haya basi, usitapetape zaidi. Naomba unigande, maana mizani ipo hapa kwa ajili yako.
Vyakula na mbegu za kitamaduni,
na kutuliza fikra na kukuwezesha kupima masuala ibuka katika jamii. Tena kwa busara. Tukutane mizani kila Ijumaa saa 1 machweo kwenye runinga ya Hope TV.
Hope TV is now available on GoTV Channel 103, Zuku Channel 873, Signet Channel 817, and Star Times Channel 026. Enjoy our uplifting content and family-friendly programming anytime. Hope TV. You look and live.
Only God can turn a mess into a message.
I have a boy on a wheelchair. Yeah. I'm still preaching on the pulpit.
Amen. Niliona mguu ya nyuma inakuja tu kunikanyaga, imenilenga tu kwa tumbo. Nikaitana tu Jesus.
I got tired of working with the x-ray papers, and one day I just woke up and decided to burn them.
A test into a testimony.
The whole community didn't want to hear that anybody is born again. Excommunicated straight.
Bila Yesu hakuna njia.
Join Sharon Naitore Wangenye on Testify.
Katika hiyo harakati hiyo spirit ikakemewa, mimi nimeona Yesu Kristo namna hii. Kwa msalaba. Opa. Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
Every Thursday at 8 p.m. for a moment to grow your faith some more.
Hope TV is now available on GoTV Channel 103, Zuku Channel 873, Signet Channel 817, and Star Times Channel 026. Enjoy our uplifting content and family-friendly programming anytime. Hope TV. You look and live.
Je, ushawahi kuweka jambo kwenye mizani? Ushawahi kupata uzito wake? Haya basi, usitapetape zaidi. Naomba unigande, maana mizani ipo hapa kwa ajili yako.
Vyakula na mbegu za kitamaduni,
na kutuliza fikra na kukuwezesha kupima masuala ibuka katika jamii. Tena kwa busara. Tukutane mizani kila Ijumaa saa 1 machweo kwenye runinga ya Hope TV.
Viewer, welcome back. This is Spotlight, and we are talking to the Executive Director, Amnesty International, Irungu Houghton, about the state of the nation. Just before we went for the break, we were talking about the need for a different kind of governance. We'll pick it up from there. Again, do engage us on 0708 222 that's our WhatsApp line. Also engage us on other social media platforms. We'll be glad to have you as part of this conversation. Now, the point is a different kind of governance. Now, that's a very insightful point, that given the margins of victory, and given the contest that was there in the Supreme Court, and now given there's a huge number of people who didn't quite vote, that should call for a consciously innovative way of leadership, that we don't have to fall back on previous ways of leadership. There needs to be a new version and an innovative way of governance. And how would that look like, Houghton?
Well, so the first thing is the word governance is distinct from the word government. So let's address the government side, then we'll come to the broader society. I mean, I think one of the things that somebody said to me is, if you're in a relationship with somebody, and the only conversations you tend to have is about their previous relationship, their ex, then most times you think twice about continuing the relationship. The other analogy is if you get into a matatu and the driver is spending most of their time looking through the rear view mirror rather than the windscreen, the temptation would be to get out at the next stop, because it's fairly predictable what's going to happen. And I think there are analogies with, or comparisons with, some of the things that we've seen in Kenya Kwanza, or the administration. The first is this preoccupation with continuing to I guess to bring back the failures of Jubilee administration. The all change, that's happened in terms of the different parastatals, the different government administrations, have in some ways, I think, made it very difficult for them to move at the speed that they would have liked to move. And I do believe that at the center of Kenya Kwanza, there is a wish to deliver on their manifesto. I don't think that they have abandoned it. I think there are people there, good people there, who are saying, no, actually we have a commitment to the Kenyan nation. But I think once you begin to see positions in different government offices as essentially ways of rewarding either political friends or people who you want to position for the next elections, then what you end up doing is you end up creating a system of patronage rather than a system of purpose. And I think that's the first challenge for the government question. But I think the second thing is on governance is that this is a very complex society, and it goes back a little bit to the deep-seated sense of grievance that people have. And most politicians globally are successful because they tap into grievances. And some very villainous politicians not only tap into grievances, but they actually create grievances. And I think the challenge now is really, you can't govern through grievance. You have to govern through consensus building, through purpose, through collaboration. And one of the things that will be an Achilles heel, or it will really hamper this government, is the idea that you need to control everything. So I think, we've seen some glimmers of hope. We've seen a great relationship, between the county governments and the national government. This is very different from where it was under the Jubilee administration for many years. And that's a good sign. But we have seen also interference in, for example, the Media Council of Kenya elections or the selection of the board. There was an attempt to try and lock out certain people who were considered to be critical of the government. We've seen, to some extent, capture of the religious community or the religious leadership to a point that pulpits have now become essentially either, podiums for politicians. And, we shouldn't forget that even this round of, this response to the mandamanos were actually announced in pulpits on Sunday. And sadly, places of worship have become businesses where it's not clear whether they are receiving financial favor from the state or just simply patronage. And I think those are some of the ways in which you kill the independent institutions and parts of society that actually can hold a country together. Okay. The lesson from 2008 and the big moment of post-election violence was that we reached a point where actually there was no trust in any other institution, not the Supreme Court, not the not the judiciary, not the National Assembly, not the civil society, not the diplomatic community. And what happened is Kenya burned, right? And it took us 3 months to be able to recover from that. So I think it's really important for Kenya Kwanza to understand that under our constitutional framework, it allows for many centers of power. And how you survive is not by destroying them and bring them under your umbrella. It is essentially allowing them to do what they are mandated to by the Constitution and giving them the power. And in some ways, we saw some good signs in the early part of the administration, the financial independence of the Inspector General, for example. For the first time, they had the responsibility of managing their own budget. We saw increased budgets for the judiciary. So there are, I say, these things are not complex. They're not magical. They are essentially good policies and good relationship building.
Okay. You mentioned the church and the religious community quite a bit. And at this particular time, we've had a season where there has been almost a blood division in the church, where there is a church that is really close really close to power. Right. But there seems to be another part of the church and religious leaders who are a little distant from power. And now at this particular time, we see the church coming up front and calling for dialogue. I know there's a call for dialogue and we can all see it, but the question usually is the church doing enough? But I would want to ask you, from where you sit, what more can the church do to make sure that this call for dialogue is actually, goes all the way?
Yeah. I mean, I think the clarity of Canon Wainaina, for example, a few weeks back, where he warned that the closer you get to power and to the state, the less distinction the congregations and the followers of the churches and the mosques can make between the state and religion. And there is a reason why several years ago, we know the history of the state. In Europe, for example, religion and the state were one, right? But there were very clear reasons why they began to separate. And I think, the religious leadership have always been a stabilizer. They've always been a moral compass. They've always been a barometer, not just in terms of capturing the temperature of the moment, but really being able to either raise virtues and values or reduce temperatures in a society. And for me, that's the power of faith. That's the power of conscience. But if you get too close to power, there are other considerations that come with that. And we all know, for example, how alluring it is to get that invitation to go to State House, lunches and dinners, and perhaps even to be able to pray for the president. There is a certain patronage and privilege that comes with that can blur your vision.
And one of the things that has really fanned the flames are words. Words that have been spoken. And they've gone wide. And maybe you can also comment on the value of words at this particular time in our country.
Yeah. No, words matter. In fact, some people say that, reality starts in a conversation. Ideas, of course, are the genesis, but once the words are spoken, they become real and they become influential. And I think, the language of compassion versus the language of cancel culture, is one tension that we have to have. The second one, of course, is the language of victim shaming. Our work essentially is protecting vulnerable communities. But victim shaming rather than solidarity or victim solidarity is another tension that we have. And too many times I think people are too comfortable. And we have to say that, wherever you feel a lack of empathy, you probably have a degree of privilege. You have a degree of power. You are removed from the experience of what it's like to have your independence, your dignity stripped from you. And therefore it becomes either a matter of amusement or entertainment. But the more that you are able to lean in and sense what it's like to be in the shoes of another person, the more you're able to connect with that person. And I think that, for me, is one of the challenges of this moment. There is really too much power and privilege. And, at the risk of not being invited back to Hope TV, Christians are very privileged, are a very privileged constituency. If you think about it, the last 3 presidents were self-declared Christians, right? So the power of being a Christian and being a majority religion in this country is something that should never be taken for granted. With that comes tremendous responsibility to look for the minority religions, to ensure that they are not targeted or disrespected and so on. But I think, I would even go a little bit further than that and just say that, at a time like this, anything that normalizes stigma, prejudice, or violence against anybody in the Republic is really something that we should challenge and call out, because, what we're seeing is a growing intolerance and violence for various groups of people. I mean, the misogyny, sexism, the sense that women cannot be independent of men's favors is still, sadly, after 60 years, alive and well in this country. And the traumatic stories you hear of women in matatus simply being molested, or even in office spaces, is something we need to take seriously. I mean, I think the other one is, we've been watching as Amnesty International very carefully the rising number of widows and elderly people who are being killed, sometimes hacked to pieces, either for just a piece of land or some savings or it's just, and it's not one community. I mean, there was a time we used to think that, the widows would be targeted as witches in places like Kilifi and Malindi, but you're now seeing it happening all over the place. I mean, Kisii, Murang'a, Kisumu, all in the last 3 or 4 months. And I think we have to challenge this idea that anybody should be victimized and made vulnerable. And, as Amnesty International, we have been quite outspoken even on the issue of, LGBTIQ groups, and we've just said to, and, I've talked to as many of the religious leaders I can, mostly privately, and I've just said, I respect the position of Christianity and Islam on this question. But I ask you to choose your words carefully. Do not get confused with those who are calling for the death penalty, who are calling for life imprisonment, who are agitating 5-year-old children to come out of mosques and say the most horrific things about fellow Kenyans. And I think, the words matter because they don't just sit on social media platforms. They actually show up in people's lives. So we had, just to give you an example, we had just recently parents of about 5 children who can't sit their examinations because the accusation was that they were gay. Right now, these are 14. I guess they would be in their 15, 16, 17 range, right? Who knows what these children were doing? Whether it was just sexual experimentation. They're in single-sex schools, but they cannot now continue their education because they've been expelled.
When you're at that, Irungu,
sure,
and because this is a conversation that's in the open right now. About the gay community and the stand of the church, which is very clear. And one of the clarities is that there is no acceptance of the practice. But in that statement, there is also that that does not mean that we do not love the people.
Right.
So I just want you to walk that narrow corridor there and just describe to us, how does compassion look like? How do human rights look like in terms of that narrow corridor that I've given you right there?
Well, I mean, the Constitution is very clear around Article 26. All human beings, deserve dignity, they deserve respect and protection. Right? So this was the theme of tonight, which is, do all Kenyans deserve respect? We have to say unequivocally, all Kenyans, and even non-Kenyans. I mean, we have a lot of refugees that have come to Kenya for sanctuary. Even refugees deserve respect and protection. Love and compassion for me has always been a recognition that you may be different, but I don't want you to be assaulted. I don't want you to be evicted from your home. I don't want you to be denied medical health or medical services. I don't want you to be thrown out of your school. I don't want you to be ridiculed and outed, in public when you are not, either you did not want to be, to have your sexual orientation or your sexual identity outed. That's love and compassion. And actually, privately, I hear a lot more of that from the religious leaders. I think there is agreement that the right to life should never be taken away from anybody for any reason. Not just this, but I think any reason. I mean, we say that we need to have compassion for the serious criminal. We don't wish to have a society where we execute or carry out the death penalty. We don't do that anymore. Why would we do that for a community that is not, for individuals who are not, either forcing themselves on others or essentially, defiling children? The law is very clear on these other two matters, which is, people need to be arrested, they need to be arraigned in court, they need to be convicted, and they need to be rehabilitated so that, society is kept safe.
All right. I think that now that the conversation is really in the open, I think also the religious community, one of the challenges is that we have to just engage is, living in that tension where you don't accept the practice, but also you have compassion on the practitioners. So it's
I love that actually.
Yeah, it's quite a tension there. Yeah. But there's a viewer who is asking a question that I think it's important for us. This is a Maandamano question.
Okay.
The viewer is asking, why we are having riots in Kibera and other low-income areas. I mean, why aren't there riots in Karen, for instance? That's what you're asking. Yeah.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think the question is probably directed best to Azimio and the organizers of the assembly.
No, the viewer thinks you would know.
Oh, okay. Perhaps I'm too close there. But no, I think I think we have to. The constitutional provision makes it clear that actually demonstrations in any part of the republic are lawful, right? So you could do this in Karen. And there was, I think, at some point, some of the overzealous Kenya Kwanza politicians proposed to do mandamanos of their own outside Martha Karoo's house and Raila Odinga's house and so on. And I think, for me, I don't know if that really helps the situation. I think what we would want to do is take these large protests away from high-density, low-income neighborhoods.
Okay.
For two reasons. One is that those are the neighborhoods in which there are a lot of activities that are happening that are difficult to manage in the context of a demonstration that gets violent. So you've got schools, you've got hospitals, you've got kiosks, you've got people essentially hustling in the streets. The best places for mandamanos and the assemblies are open spaces, right? So, at some point, I hope the Inspector General will kind of look at the scenario that's unfolding. We'll look at what happened on the 20th, look at what happened on the 27th, and we'll declare that the best place for one of these demonstrations would be a place like any of the big stadia that we have, or even the open spaces. And Uhuru Park had played this role for many years. Historically, it's a place of political liberation. and democracy. It's the equivalent of our Hyde Park corner where they used to in the UK. In London, people used to get onto boxes. And then, everybody from the environmentalist to the one that was slightly egotistical could just stand up and just talk. And you would go there on a Sunday and you would listen. I was a student in the UK. We did this. We loved it, because you could listen to all kinds of people. But the understanding was it would be non-violent, it would be non-offensive, and essentially you would listen for a couple of hours and go home.
Okay.
So I think we do need to find locations that are not in residential areas and find places that are open and really not disruptive of the other business activities. We can't expect the entire country. Well, let's put it this way. It is also a constitutional right of people not to go on to the demonstration, right? Not to be picketing, not to be involved. And people should respect that also.
All right. And just finally, as we come to the closure of this conversation, most of the times when we talk about rights, human rights, we would usually address institutions like the police, for instance.
Right.
But as we close this conversation, would you also just say something about the role of the individual, in maintaining the rights of the other?
Yeah. So, Amnesty International, and just to mention, Edward, over the last 2 months, we've actually become a section, which means that we are now completely independent from the International Secretariat. And it means that I, as the Executive Director, I am managed by a Kenyan board. The Kenyan board is elected by the membership. The membership now is in the range of about 2,000 Kenyans. They're in 12 to, I think, 15 different counties in terms of sizable numbers. And what we realize as a very diverse movement of members is that, diversity is both a strength and a challenge, right? So in our ranks, we have people who have different positions on the death penalty. We have people who have different positions on extrajudicial killings, on forced evictions, and so on. But it is part of the spirit of Amnesty over the last 60 years is that that's where citizenship is found. You actually don't want clones. You want people who are debating issues. And that's why it's so great that we can have an open discussion on all the controversial subjects, right? But I think, by doing that, we actually create the conditions for a society that's much more tolerant, that is much more compassionate, and is not always preoccupied with self, but with the other. And I think for me, that is human rights as well. I mean, we often say that without constitutionalism, there is no constitution. Without human rights defenders, there are no human rights. And human rights defenders are not only activists in the sense of the street protesters. They are engineers, they are accountants, they are doctors, they are we had a meeting last night to discuss the annual report, and I was just blown away by the diversity of the people there. People traveled all the way from Masai Mara University. There were students. There were people coming from Mukuru kwa Jenga. That is the Kenya that we need. That's the Kenya we need to embrace. So that actually it doesn't really matter whether we have human rights organizations or not, because there are people in every community who will be ready to stop their car, to step aside, to lean over, to protect, even when it is inconvenient. Martin Luther King's famous "The Knock at Midnight" is always for me one of the best, best of his writings. And he talks about, and it is of course biblical, right? It is that knock that came at midnight. Would you open the door? When it's most inconvenient, it may even be scary. Is that the time that you would open your doors for somebody in a time of need? And that is the human rights culture that we have to build here. I will be remiss if I didn't invite your viewers to become members of Amnesty International. I very warmly welcome all of you who are watching, amnestykenya.org. It's fairly painless. It takes 3 minutes. And, you become my boss, as I keep telling people, because I have to listen to my members. It's no longer the simple NGO model.
All right. Great. Thank you so much. And what we talked about Martin Luther King Jr., it just maybe sets up for us the next conversation, which should just engage some of the writings of Martin Luther King Jr. You seem to be, you cite him pretty often. So I'm sure we'll get lots of insights from that. I think that would form another perfect conversation. Again, thank you so much, Irungu Houghton, for your insights and perspectives, your own spotlight. again, they have been hope-raising, just like you had hoped.
Thank you.
Viewer, thank you so much for being part of Spotlight this evening. And one very helpful line that has just come from our guest tonight is that let's cease our preoccupation with self. Let's dare to care consistently for the other. This has been Spotlight. Thank you for watching.
Je, ushawahi kuweka jambo kwenye mizani? Ushawahi kupata uzito wake? Haya basi, usitapetape zaidi. Naomba unigande, maana mizani ipo hapa kwa ajili yako.
Vyakula na mbegu za kitamaduni,
na kutuliza fikra na kukuwezesha kupima masuala ibuka katika jamii. Tena kwa busara. Tukutane mizani kila Ijumaa saa 1 machweo kwenye runinga ya Hope TV.
Only God can turn a mess into a message.
I have a boy on a wheelchair. I'm still preaching on the pulpit.
Niliona mguu ya nyuma inakuja tu kunikanyaga, imenilenga tu kwa tumbo. Nikaitana tu Jesus.
I got tired of working with the X-ray papers, and one day I just woke up and decided to burn them.
A test into a testimony.
The whole community didn't want to hear that anybody is born again. Excommunicated, straight.
Bila Yesu hakuna njia.
Join Sharon Naitore Wangenye on Testify.
Katika hiyo harakati hiyo spirit ikakemewa, mimi nimeona Yesu Kristo namna hii. Kwa msalaba. Opa. Hallelujah. Hallelujah.